Stay tuned for Butler on Business, coming up next on the Liberty Express.
How you doing, Mark?
I'm doing fine, Alan, and it's good to be on with you again. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, anytime we're talking free markets and right to work and all, I'm all for it. Let's talk about the mission first of the National Right to Work.
Very straightforward, very simple, Alan. I wish it could be more complicated, but we believe that every worker ought to have the right to join a union, but no one should be forced as a condition of employment to pay dues or fees to a union. It's that simple.
Mark, I would agree with you everywhere except for these civil servants that are now unionized and actually form the bulk of the union membership.
You're absolutely right, Alan. You know, there are more government union members in America than there are private sector union members now. But the idea that they could join unions is something that we ought to protect. The question is the state required to recognize them on behalf of bargaining against taxpayers? And that is another issue, and I'm in agreement with you on that. Allowing people to join private organizations is one thing. Giving them monopoly power in government, even the AFL-CIO found that abhorrent. The executive committee of the AFL-CIO, and even George Meany, AFL-CIO president himself, said you can't unionize government.
Yet they did it anyway.
They do it, and that's if you're looking at growth sectors and product lines, the public sector is the final frontier for organized labor, that's for sure.
Mark, I love Manhattan, but the last time I was in Manhattan, not too long ago, I was in an elevator that had an elevator operator. Mm-hmm. And then there was another elevator operator, and what this guy was doing for me was asking me what floor, and I told him, and he'd press the button, and then we'd ride up to my floor, and then the door would open, and he'd ride back down. And I'm sitting there doing the math, and then I got friendly like I do with the manager of the hotel. I mean, hell, I'm everybody's friend everywhere I go, whether they like me or not. And I asked him, I said, Mr. Manager, why the elevator guy? I hadn't seen something like that since the movies. I think The Road to Perdition was the last time I saw an elevator operator, and is that union? That is a union work requirement.
Yeah. Yeah, Alan, sometimes we get into these modes where the protection of things that we would think are not necessary anymore is something that unfortunately happens under a union monopoly. I mean, feather bedding and increasing, or maintaining jobs that you can make the case are no longer necessary is something that it comes out of the monopoly power that union officials have over workers and employers in many cases. They could strike over that. You can't take away that job because it's a union job and we're going to have it and it's bargain and you can't do anything about it. And that's not necessarily a great way to run a business. I mean, back when elevators were relatively new technology, that you had to have someone there to run the thing. But nowadays they are, I still struggle with it, Alan, but they're fairly easy to operate.
I would agree. Now, back in my prior life, I owned a couple manufacturing companies, and one of those companies made what we called filtration media. We supplied a mesh that went into air filters, and I was at an AC Delco plant in Flint, Michigan, and we were taking a tour of the plant, and I saw one fella driving a forklift and another fella sitting on the forklift, and I asked the guy, now, what's with that second fella? And he said, well, he's watching out, what the first fella's doing. Mm-hmm. And I asked him, I looked at him, I'm born right here. The unions are kind of alien down here. And it was a union requirement. And then there was another guy whose title, I think, was something like inventory watcher. And what this fella did is if you got over there near the inventory, he popped up from around the racks. And I'm asking him, well, what's this guy do? And he says, well, that's another union job. He's watching the inventory. And I'm like, well, watching it do what? It's just sitting there in a rack.
Yeah. Yeah, those are interesting situations, and unfortunately, it's not really that funny. I mean, we certainly are in an environment where creating jobs is an important element of this economy. It's something that needs to be done and needs to be focused on. But protecting jobs like that really are not adding value anymore in a particular situation is something difficult to defend, that's for sure.
Mark, but now let's back to your mission. Your mission is to allow people to work without being compelled to join a union.
Absolutely right. That's it. It's single. That's our single mission, and it's easy to understand.
Why does the South traditionally have a right to work and the North traditionally does not?
Well, that's an interesting question. I was just doing a radio show earlier this morning, and that issue came up. And, it has to do with the culture of the South, the agrarian nature versus the so-called industrial nature of the North. I just seem to think that folks down there, and remember, when right to work passed in Georgia and other states down there, the Democrats were in charge of the legislature. There wasn't a Republican to be found down there in the 1940s and 50s when these laws were being passed. And so the fact is, I think that people believed in the individual freedom, and this notion of compelling someone to pay dues or fees to an organization they didn't ask for, didn't want, and never voted for is something that is an anathema to folks that believe in kind of the individualism and that notion of kind of the Jeffersonian principle of this is we need to stand up and fight for ourselves, and we can take care of ourselves, that kind of notion.
Mark, now y'all were actively involved in that Boeing situation, were you not?
Yes, we were. We actually represented employees in South Carolina who were granted intervener status in that litigation.
And what does that mean exactly?
Well, they were actually a party in the litigation. These employees came to us and said, it looks like our rights are being violated. We need your help. And so the foundation actually provided free legal aid to these employees and was granted status as a party in the lawsuit.
Mark, how can listeners help you in your effort?
Well, they can obviously go to our website and find out information about us. There's plenty of ways to be involved there. Our website is www.nrtw.org, and there's lots of opportunities to learn about what we do, to be involved in what we do, and to help what we do.
Mark, there's one thing that's always been curious to me. Let's talk about the sports, the professional sports. On the one hand, they're collective bargaining organizations. Yeah. On the other hand, they negotiate individually.
Yeah.
That's always got me a little perplexed. In unionism, everybody gets paid the same regardless of whether they get. It's basically the Communist Manifesto in the labor force. Isn't that the main mindset of that collective bargaining?
Absolutely, and this notion that we've got to apply these quote unquote benefits and conditions of employment equally across the board is something that unions defend and fight for, and it is the rhetoric of that collectivism. But interestingly enough, in the athletic field, and these guys pay union dues as a percentage of their salary, so that makes a little difference. But here you have the most kind of outrageous discrepancy between a journeyman special teamer who's making $400,000 a year and a 9-year veteran at quarterback who's making $18 million a year. It's interesting, Alan, you mentioned this because in order to get that agreement, the football players had to decertify their union in order to get the agreement, which was very interesting. No one seems to pay much attention to the fact that they had to decertify the union to get the new contract, and then they all went back and recertified the union. But, yeah, the rhetoric of this equality goes out the window when you talk about sports.
I've always found that to be interesting, and I appreciated your insight on that.
Yeah.
But part of this union, particularly these civil service unions, that's why we're seeing the teacher of the year getting laid off. When the wino that hadn't shown up for work in 3 months still has a job. Things like that. I don't like the unions. Never have.
Well, and that's right, Alan, and that's one of the things that this kind of collectivism spawns. It's this notion that the only way you get ahead in a particular environment where the union is the master is that you're there one more day than the guy behind you. And whether you're the best or the worst or medium or mediocre or white, black, brown, or yellow, it doesn't matter. It's just simply a matter of, you step up the scale and pay when you get to this particular anniversary of your job, and that just doesn't make any sense in a country that rewards or supposed to reward individual effort and achievement.
When I say I don't like the unions, I like the union members, but I think the union members are being chumped by the union leadership. It looks like the leaders are fat and happy while their members are struggling paying their dues.
That's exactly right, Alan. That's a very important point. Often the chasm between union officials and the folks that are running the unions here in Washington, D.C., and running the international unions around the country, the chasm between them and the rank-and-file workers they claim to represent is growing wider and wider all the time, and particularly as we see the growth in the public sector, because the implications of the work that union officials are doing in government actually result in increased taxes most of the time for their brothers and sisters in the private sector who've got to foot the bill for this stuff. And so that disparity, that chasm between the two, is growing wider and wider, and you make a very, very good point.
I always enjoy talking to you, Mark. We are out of time. This is Mark Mix, El Presidente of the National Right to Work Foundation.
Thank you, Alan. It's been a pleasure.